All right, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, April 25th, and you were just telling me that you want to talk a bit about the Ukraine casualty numbers. So I'll give you the floor. What's going on?
Well, sure. There was just an interesting piece of information that came out a few days ago. It was there was another body exchange. And these happen every few weeks, and there have been a total, I think, of 61 so far, starting in May of 2022. And then we have records, or at least there's this one kind of military statistic project called I don't know who runs it. I don't think it's not official, but it seems to be quite reliable, by a Russian, called Lost Armor. And they don't the people there don't just track what's happening in the Ukraine war, but also in Yemen and other places as well. So anyway, they do have these statistics. It's not like they invented it. These statistics are available and announced, every time there's a body exchange. And the most recent exchange came out to something like, 41 Russian bodies and 909 Ukrainian bodies. And that's the largest ratio. That's approximately 22 to 1. It's a huge ratio, a huge difference right there. And it's part of a trend. It's not like this is some sort of aberration. If you look at the graph and, the previous exchanges, you'll see that starting a little better than a year ago, approximately around the time of Avdiivka, it's just that the number of Ukrainian bodies started to increase, and then it really to accelerate. So now it's a very steep curve if you graph it. It's just, I think, previous to this, it was like 17 to 1 and then 16 to 1. It's been rising steadily from maybe 2 to 1 way back a year ago. So this is interesting. It obviously reflects some difference on a change on the battlefield. And what would that be? I mean, what does this tell us? I think you'd have to say it's about movement more than anything on the battlefield. If you have a completely static battlefront, there could be a lot of violence, a lot of people dying, but the other side's not going to be picking up the bodies. So, for example, if if the Russians are just pulverizing the Ukrainians in their trenches and bunkers and hitting convoys behind the lines, and to give an example too, is like these missile strikes that can be deep in the interior. That's not going to show up. None of that's going to show up because it's all within Ukrainian controlled territory. So the Ukrainians, okay, they lose their men are killed, but they pick up the remains, and return them to their families, and that's how it goes. So that none of those casualties appear in the statistics. And, it's just likewise for the Russians. So you could have a very violent conflict, but if the line is static, you're just going to see very few remains being picked up by the other side. Very little need for a body exchange. But so what does this show? It shows, I think, essentially that the Russians are successfully attacking, and the Ukrainians, their counterattacks, which we hear about quite frequently, are not successful, because it's in those situations where the Russians are going to be collecting Ukrainian remains. Just to give you an example, just to illustrate, if the Russians rush across the field and take a Ukrainian trench, the Ukrainians are, either all the soldiers there die and the Russians collect those remains, or maybe a few escape, but they don't have time to take their fallen comrades with them. So that's one instance. It's a successful Russian attack is going to be reflected in this exchange, in these body exchanges. But then also an unsuccessful, like, Ukrainian counterattack. If the Ukrainians attempt to rush across the field, and maybe they take a building or a trench, but the Russians retreat in good order, they know what they're doing, and then come back quickly and take them, well, they're going to again pick up a lot of Ukrainian remains. So I think that's what we're seeing. It's been a really striking increase. And interesting, that you see the increase even over the last few months when things really slowed down. You would think that, there's less movement on the front, in the months of, for example, December, January, and into February. But I think at least part of the reason we're seeing this acceleration, especially this huge 22-to-1 ratio, the last one, is that there is the Kursk debacle for the Ukrainians. That was a true collapse. And in that kind of situation, the Russians are going to be picking up a lot of Ukrainian bodies. And I think that's what happened. And I think it's reflected in that recent ratio. That's my guess.
Do we know if many of these bodies that they recovered are some of them non-Ukrainian, NATO or mercenaries from the UK or Poland, etc.?
Yeah, you hear reports on that. I think there's no question. Well, they're not going to be in these exchanges, so they're not going to be included. That's something that they're going to have to deal separately, with the respective countries, or maybe through Ukraine, but it's not part of the general exchange. So, I don't think that's, I may be wrong, but that's not being mentioned in these reports, the reports of the body exchanges.
Do you think those numbers are hidden? I mean, the governments obviously don't want to give the extent of their involvement if their men are dying in Ukraine or in Kursk.
Well, they've been quite public about it. At least the Russians have been. It's something you'll see reports in RT, whatever. It's not something that they've tried to hide.
Right. I meant like on the Western side, though. They're hiding. Yeah. They don't want to.
Yeah, I think you know how it is. There is the narrative, and the narrative, the Ukrainians are always somehow just, even when they're retreating, the Russians are suffering many more casualties and so on and so forth. So this doesn't help that narrative.
Do we know how many casualties have been in the war total now? I mean, I hear different numbers
it's
constantly.
Really hard to know. I just don't know. I think, again, the most reliable source for Russian casualties, anyway, is Mediazona, the Mediazona BBC project. And, what they do, they have two methods. And, one involves, a fair amount of guesswork. And it doesn't, I've looked at it in the past. It doesn't make sense because it doesn't really reflect what's going on in the battlefield. But if you look over time, it seems like they changed the way that they represent the information. For whatever reason, when I looked at it more recently, it was harder to see. But in the past, you could see the graph. There was a very clear spikes in Russian casualties around certain events. During the first couple of weeks of the war, for example, when the Russians, when the SMO was launched, that's not surprising. Another was during Bakhmut. And actually, interestingly, the body exchange shows the same thing, that there was no, it wasn't Bakhmut, but actually one place where there were more Russian remains being picked up than Ukrainian was during the 2023 offensive. Because that's the one time when the Ukrainians were advancing. They didn't advance very much, but they did. They did take some trenches. They did take some. So you don't see anything like the 22-to-1, but you saw some like 2-to-1s and 3-to-1s for a couple months there. And again, it's a reflection of movement, a combination of movement and firepower. Let's put it that way. But anyway, going back to Mediazona, their statistics show a spike at the beginning, and then another one at Bakhmut. And then a smaller one actually at the beginning of Avdiivka. And then after that, it's just been steady or dropping ever since. And they have now a total of, I think, 101,000, that they say they were able to confirm. And it seems that they do have a rigorous methodology. It's not just guesswork, it's not, what they do is they actually go read obits and read local papers, because if somebody's let's say in a town was killed on the front, that's going to appear in the news. And they even go to cemeteries and so they try to be as thorough as they can. They can't be sure that they've gotten everybody, but I think they get pretty close. And so that 101,000 is, I think, a reliable figure. It's got to be close to the actual total. I mean, that's the best that we have. Now, with the Ukrainians, we just don't know. There's something similar on the Ukrainian side, but I have my doubts about how rigorous it is.
So they're really, I mean, I hear numbers like 1 million on the Ukrainian side. Will we know at some point?
We might, yeah. I wish actually the Russians would say,
I,
I don't, I think they should be honest about it. But for whatever reason, they made a choice not to reveal those numbers.
yeah, I
I
was
think,
going to ask you that. Why aren't the Russians reporting casualty numbers? We're completely in the dark. I think it's a very important thing
yeah,
in terms of being able to end this war. If we saw that the casualty numbers were 8-1 in favor of
right,
the Russians, that for every Russian
yeah,
that died, 8 Ukrainians were dying, it'd
right.
be
Well, I
like,
mean, except we wouldn't know what the ratio is because the Ukrainians aren't revealing. Occasionally Zelensky will say something, but it's just that nobody believes it, including I think nobody in Ukraine believes it. Most definitely in Ukraine, nobody believes it. I think he said 37,000, then he went up to 41,000, and that's just not even close. It may be off by a magnitude of 10. I don't know. Again, we can just speculate. You can say that, like on the Russian side, their disadvantage is that they are advancing in general, or they're attacking much more than the Ukrainians are. Now, there are big exceptions to that. There are these counterattacks that the Ukrainians continuously launch, and they fail. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the bodies. And then there was Kursk, where, again, they were just out in the open and attacking. But more often than not, they're hunkered down in their bunkers and in places like Donbass and in different fortifications, and so they have the advantage of being on the defense. But they also are at an extreme disadvantage when it comes to artillery. It's something that they have admitted to many times. Sometimes we hear a ratio of 10-1, 5-1, whatever. It's a huge difference. The Russians have just a total superiority in that category. And of course, artillery can cause a lot of casualties, even to people who are hunkered down. And then Russia has pretty much an absolute air superiority, and so they use these glide bombs at will. And these glide bombs can just take out bunkers and all kinds of fortifications. So, in spite of having the advantage of being on the defensive, I think that advantage of the Ukrainians is more than nullified by the superior Russian firepower. So I would just guess, I assume, but it's a guess, that there are more deaths, considerably more deaths on the Ukrainian side. I think probably the most telling is just what you're seeing with the mobilization efforts. The Ukrainians are running out of people, and you see the average Ukrainian man is terrified at the idea of going to the front. Recently, there was an effort to try to get the 18 to 24s to volunteer. That's one group that they haven't been conscripting so far. So they actually offer these very, very generous financial packages, and they had a media blitz, and it went on for roughly 3 months. And in that time, they got 500. That shows you there's very little willingness on the other side. And I think it's probably the awareness of the huge casualties. And, in contrast, on the Russian side, yeah, they're offering nice financial packages, kind of the equivalent of what they tried with the 1824s in Ukraine. They're quite generous, it's true. But a lot of people are signing up. Again, it's admitted that it's better than it was for a while, 30,000. It's been going up. It's something like 40,000 a month. And if casualties were that extreme, people would know, even if it's not being reported. People know. They know, like my friend, my cousins, they all went off and none of them came back, or only half of them came back, or something like that. They say, I'm not going. But that's obviously just not happening. So I think that's the most telling thing. I don't know what it is, but clearly the casualties are skewed in favor of the Russians.
yeah, it's these numbers, even on the Russian side, 101,000.
That's a
It's a
lot. Yeah.
large number. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, just thinking in World War II, the U.S. lost what, 500,000? Is that right?
Approximately, yes.
Approximately 500,000, and we are have more population in America. Russia is what, like
Well, it
160
was about the same. I
back
think
then.
America back then is about like Russia now. Actually, Russian population really took a huge hit because of World War II. All those young men that were killed, that set back Russian demographics, by decades. And Russia would probably have a lot more people now if it wasn't for World War II. They have roughly 150 million now.
Yeah, it is a big number, and you think on the Ukrainian side, we know it's going to be higher than that. I hear people say 1,000,000, 500,000. Maybe we'll find out.
Yeah,
But regardless,
right.
for a country that size, it's devastating. I don't think this war is just kind of going on in the background. I don't think people can fully absorb the amount of loss, the sacrifice of all these bodies, all these men. Like that
Yeah,
is it's a huge number.
right,
We see what's happening in Gaza, and it's horrific because it's primarily civilians, and
right.
we're seeing it constantly. But we're talking about maybe when this is all said and done, maybe 1,000,000 people, men that have died in this conflict in Ukraine. I mean, America, we haven't sacrificed the way that these countries have sacrificed in
Yeah,
terms of human loss.
right.
It's really horrifying.
Yeah, no,
And
it is. It's a very bloody war. It's actually again 101,000 is a lot, but I think that like the Russian figure would be much higher if the Russians were more aggressive. They get a lot of criticism, or Putin does, the Russian government does, for being so cautious and proceeding, so methodically uh, on the front. But again, when you aggressive attacks are just result, and this has always been true, even prior to the invention of drones. It's always been true that those large scale big arrow attacks result in a lot of casualties among the attackers. I heard a figure just the other day that when the Russians or the Soviets took Vienna towards the end of World War II, they lost 150,000 men in that campaign alone. And he said, it's just like,
you don't even hear about that.
yeah, right. But
It's
that was just a footnote to, because again, they lost a total of 27 million people, quite a few civilians, but, mostly soldiers. And, yeah, so anyway, I think that's one of the things that quite clearly that's been holding the Russians back. They're trying to be careful and preserve the lives of their men.
Have we ever seen something like what Ukraine is experiencing? The inability to mobilize, having to do forced conscriptions like this because you have no manpower, and there seems to be no sign. It seems like Zelensky he's showing no signs of wanting to negotiate and end this war. But you don't have any men, and you're having to pull people off the street. You can't get people to
Yeah.
volunteer. Have we had a war like that where this is how it kept on going? Is that you have to just, force conscript people, pull people off the
Yeah.
street?
I can't think of a historical parallel. There must be one somewhere, but not in recent history. I don't think even under the Nazis, they didn't have that kind of problem. They didn't have to grab people. I mean, I'm sure that we would have seen newsreels or reports of that if that had happened. Maybe it did, but I'm not aware of it. But it's just a constant feature of life in Ukraine now.
It's crazy. It makes this whole thing so sinister that that we can't end this war, and the Europeans seem to want to keep it going. Zelensky wants to keep it going when the people don't want to fight. And it just seems so wrong to
Yeah.
say, okay, keep on going into the meat grinder, die. We'll run out of boys. We'll try to lower the age more. And, we'll try to pull in people from Europe or whatever so they can continually die. And it's like, for what? Like, what are they trying to? What are they selling people? Is it just this idea that if we don't do this now, they'll be walking, right down the Champs Elysees before you know it?
Yeah, well, sometimes they make those claims, not always. In general, the idea is, well, we can't reward the aggressor. Like the Russians can't be rewarded for their aggressive behavior. That would be appeasement. It would send the wrong signal to both to the Russians in the future, but also to the Chinese. The Chinese will see this and they'll take Taiwan. That's the kind of argument that they make. Let's say even if you believe that. You have to stop and think. It's just like we've been hearing that argument for well over 2 years, nearly the whole 3 years of probably the whole the entirety of the SMO, right? Um, and most definitely ever since the fall of 2022, the situation has gotten progressively worse for the Ukrainians. And so it's just like what you're saying is okay. It's been getting worse and worse, and actually the deterioration on the Ukrainian lines has been, um, in spite of the Rasputitsa and the slowdown and a couple months ago, still you could see overall it's been accelerating. It just it's getting worse at a faster rate. Um, so but they say that still we can't let them, we can't let the Russians profit from this. We can't let maybe you believe this, maybe you truly believe this, but you still have to be realistic. It's just like with every passing month, with every passing year, it gets worse for Ukraine, and the Russians are stronger and they have more. So if you really want, you don't have a choice between, let's say, depriving the Russians of all, the gains of the war and, the current situation. You have a choice between the current situation and a future in which the Russians have even more. That's the realistic thing. So it's just like they're still trying to tell themselves and other people that we can turn this around. And now, how long are we going to believe this? Again, it's for a lot better than 2 years. They've been saying that, and things have just been getting worse and worse and worse. Where is it? What's the plan you have? What's the wonder weapon? You've thrown all the wonder weapons in there. You've had your great counteroffensive, and you had the Kursk incursion, and all of them ended in utter failure. You had the Krinky bridgehead, which was one of the greatest disasters of all. Every attempt at actually trying to take back some of that territory has just been utterly disastrous. So where is your plan? They don't, they just sort of like, well, we'll just hope for some sort of black swan event, some kind of miracle. That's not a plan. That's not what responsible statesmen do. You just look at the reality and you say, actually, the best thing for Ukraine is if we just take Putin's offer right now. Okay, they would lose those 4 oblasts in Crimea, but we're not going to get them back. And at least they would still have access to the Black Sea. They would still have Odessa and Nikolaev and Dnipro and Kharkov. There's still a big chunk of it they would keep. They would be a viable country, and they would still have control of in most, at least in the northern part, both sides of the Dnieper. But if we don't, the Russians are going to keep on marching. They'll start to demand more, and then the situation always gets worse and worse and worse. So it's just this refusal to recognize reality. This kind of emphasis on moral purity. And again, I certainly believe it's a false moral purity. I mean, the truth is that again, like the origins of the war are not just Russian aggression and inquisitiveness. There's obviously much more to that. And in fact, the Russians kept on trying to allow the Ukrainians to hang on to territory, and the Ukrainians didn't let. So, even the moral purity argument just doesn't work. They are fundamentally deluded, and this delusion is leading to the destruction of Ukraine.
I think a big problem that we have in ending this conflict is the narrative control. Both parties are operating in completely different realms. So the ability to reach some peace settlement now is impossible. Like we saw this just recently, like the idea of having Crimea recognized as the U.S. recognizing Crimea as part of Ukraine, part of Russia, sorry. And the Europeans were like, no way, we're not going to go along with this. Zelensky rejects it outright. But then the Russians are like, well, this is not enough. Of course, Crimea is part of Russia, and so it always has been. That's never even been a debate. So even that small concession, they can't agree on. It's not.
I mean, the Russians would accept it, but
but it's not enough.
Nowhere near. Nowhere near enough. Right, exactly.
Right. So if I was the Trump administration, what instead of trying to force some negotiation now, what you should be working on is just changing the narrative. And you have ample ammunition to start pumping out the reality of this war. Start talking about the casualty numbers in Ukraine and the forced conscriptions,
Right.
the fact that that these men are being dragged off the streets, that
Right.
people don't want to fight, that we're running out of, that there is no future for Ukraine. We've sacrificed a whole generation of people here. And then start talking about the Banderism. People don't
Hmm.
even know what Banderites are. Most people don't
Yeah.
understand
Right.
this true ultra nationalist Nazi element that is in power, that is in control, that you can really expose as being tied to Nazism, which we all agree as the most evil thing ever. And everybody wants to bring up parallels of World War II. We got to be Churchill, don't be Neville Chamberlain and appease the Russians. Russia is the new Hitler. It's like, well, look, if we want to use the World War II analogy and talk about trying to stop Hitler and the rise of fascism and Nazism, it's like what we have now in Ukraine. There are very strong elements of Nazism. And that is a goal that Putin has laid out, is the denazification. So they could explain what that means. What does Russia mean when they say denazification? Say, well, yeah, there is
Hmm.
an issue, this
Right.
banderism, and we were aware of this to some extent prior to the invasion. There were some acknowledgement that okay, yeah, there is a bit of a neo-Nazi problem that Ukraine has that we gotta be aware of. Shine a light on that. Shine a light
Right.
on the forced conscriptions, and then you can shift the narrative, and then it can allow the administration and just the people throughout the world to kind of adopt a more rational approach to this, and we can begin to talk to Russia. Other countries, European countries, can talk to Russia, normalize things. Their populations will understand. It could change. That's where the battle needs to be fought. Is the narrative, I
Yeah.
think.
Well, no, I agree that it's very, very important. It shapes reality. It shapes it. It also because it shapes. You can have a narrative which is based on reality, but you can have one that is just fundamentally opposed to reality. And if you if you subscribe to the latter, then you're just unable to make any reasonable policy decisions. And I would say that that's what's happening. There have been some breakthroughs under Trump. There has been a shift, but I think we got a long, long ways to go. It's again with everything again under Trump, including his own statements, and um, it's inconsistent. You're getting conflicted. A lot of the old narrative is still there, and I think a lot of it's still in Trump's mind. But there has been an intrusion of reality, and one good example of that was J.D. Vance and that. Uh, let's say fiasco of a press conference in the White House. Uh, he did bring up the conscription problem. I think that's the first time that any Western leader has, to my knowledge anyway, that he brought it up. I think the mainstream media generally ignored it. But you should be hammering on these things. You should, a disciplined administration, if it makes a decision, okay, we're going to change the narrative, then you got to have everybody on board and just repeat it. Otherwise, the occasional statement, it just doesn't get through. And that's just the way it is. The narrative always reasserts itself. So, there have been occasional breakthroughs that it has been helpful. I think like the perception of Russia, especially among, Republican leaning um, voters and the population in general has improved. But there's still a lot of work to do. And yeah, what happens, I think, is that, we have put so much into the information war at Ukraine and the West in general, and we're really very good at it. The problem is that we actually become, I think, a victim of our own narratives. So you have, so a lot of our people, our generals and so on, and end up just, watching the evening news and they just think this is reality. Maybe they get these reports, and the reports, unfortunately, from may be tailored to the prejudices of whoever's receiving the report, whether it's the president or a general or whoever. Um, but but even if occasionally something breaks through, which I'm sure it does, you get some honest intelligence. Still, you just you think you know what the reality is, and you don't really. You still hang on to that. I mean, that's right. That power of the narrative, of which can be a false reality, is really something that's not to be discounted. And so, yeah, I think a real battle needs to be fought there. And again, it's just like so much that Trump's done. Yeah, they've done some things, but it's just there's a lack of consistency, a lack of coherence, and we have a long ways to go.
I think what's worrying is just the trend that we're seeing. Like you said, there was a lot of some positive signs of breaking through the narrative in the beginning. That smackdown that JD Vance and Trump laid on Zelensky was glorious to witness. And he brought up, like you said, the forced conscription. And then I think it was Donald Trump Jr. posted right after that. All said, this is what JD Vance was talking about in terms of forced mobilization. It was showing, and he posted these videos of all these horrific videos of forced conscription in Ukraine and people being beat up and dragged out of their cars and things like this. And I was like, wow, this is great. The son of the president is aware of what's happening, is showing this. But then after that, it just kind of died away. And it seems like we're slipping back into, not telling the truth and not trying to break the narrative. And we're just getting dragged into the war. It's like the war machine won. The neocon, the establishment just moving forward. Maybe they've distracted Trump with too many things and just said, don't worry about him as president. You're going to look weak if you do this. Just keep on going or whatever it is. Why is that? Why do you think we've stopped? It's kind of reversed. And now I don't feel very hopeful.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it you just have to point to Donald Trump himself. That he has a lot of, like I think I've always said, he has a lot of healthy instincts. But he just kind of lacks the moral character or the intellectual fortitude or something to really carry through in a disciplined way to make the change. He doesn't really have a strategy. He's a guy who shoots from the hip. He says this, he says that, and a lot of the things he says are true, and they do have an impact. But to really change the course of U.S. foreign policy. Again, it's like changing the course of a super tanker. You've got to actually grab I don't know if you say a steering wheel. I'm sorry for it, whatever. But, grab the wheel anyway. We'll say, yeah. It's like and turn it, and you just got to and keep it turning. You can't just like occasionally, turn it a few degrees, slap it or whatever. That's kind of what Trump does, and occasionally it shifts a little bit, but then there's these great inertial forces, that just kind of push it back onto its original trajectory. And you can say that that's just true. There's just the narrative has its own power, and if you don't really work hard at constructing a counter narrative, the narrative, occasionally there will be exceptions that rise up and cause, raise some eyebrows and get some people to wonder. And you may, because of those exceptions, there are a few intellectually curious and, very concerned people that will break away. But by and large, most people will just forget about it a couple of weeks later and they're back on the same old course, believing in the same old narrative. So you just have to be really focused and, disciplined. And that's not what Trump is, unfortunately. So I think we're seeing that in the case of the narrative war, but then also like in the negotiations with, over the Ukraine war, that, I think he's actually he legitimately wishes to bring this war to an end. And that's to his credit, but you can't just make these statements, boast, we'll do it in a week, or, I'll just send my buddy, Steve, over to there and he'll just hash something out you're going to have to, first of all, just fully understand what the situation is, make a hard decision and then stick with it. And then, put together a negotiating team so you can iron out the details. Understand that no matter what, it's going to take months to do. And that you're going to be attacked, there all kinds of people are going to, say that you're selling out. You just have to make a decision ahead of time. That's what I'm going to do. Instead of just, it's instead of what we're seeing right now.
But it doesn't seem that difficult, to start putting out counter narrative information, putting out the truth of what's happening. Like everything I said, talking about the forced conscriptions and talking about, the Banderism, the neo-Nazi elements, there's a lot of ammunition here that you can use. You
Yeah.
can even start debunking previous atrocities like the Bucha massacre or all these things. Like you can, and the atrocities that happened in Kursk where civilians were massacred in the basement. I heard in one of I don't know if it was Touretsk or one of the Ukrainian cities when the Ukrainians left, they killed every single man left in that town. I
Yeah.
forget which one. I heard
Yeah,
it
it
from
wasn't
Alexander
Tourette's.
Kursk.
I know. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But anyways, there's a litany of horrific things that you can bring to the forefront and say, like, look, this is complicated. This is not Russia bad, Ukraine good. There's a lot of bad on the Ukraine side that can be exposed. And if we can do that, we can start to hasten the end of this war and begin to move into that multipolar world, start establishing friendly relations with Russia. Because already within this country, the United States, it's like pretty split. A lot of people are thinking like are more friendly with Russia than they are with Ukraine. It's like 50-50 here in the United States almost. Wouldn't you
Yeah.
say?
Well, not quite. But yeah, it's approaching that.
Yeah,
We'll
it's
just say
approaching
that.
there.
Yeah.
Right. So
Well,
you can
Right.
there's room.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
room
Again,
to move.
yeah. It's just not like like Israel and Palestine, where okay, well there is again in
That's
the younger
50-50.
generation. Yeah. Okay, but yeah, it's just those people that are supported are just so passionate. We have a real problem. Passionate Ukraine supporters exist. Like we have the assassin or would be assassin, for example. Those people do exist, but they are a fringe element. And so that can be, those views can be changed. But you do have to, say, yeah, the information is there. It's true. And what we hear that information in the alternative, media ecosystem. And again, it's not just guys like us, amateurs, but real pros like John Mearsheimer, for example, or Jeffrey Sachs. These people are extremely knowledgeable, and so it's like there are all kinds of authorities that you can actually point to, and you can bring them in. You can start talking to them, and to the credit of people like Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson, we're having that happen to some extent, right? In that part of the media ecosystem. But you could actually push harder, and with pressure from the White House, you could get somebody like you could get these people on maybe Fox News or something. Right now it's not possible; they're shut out. But Fox News tries to stay aligned with White House policies, and so. Yeah, there's things you could do, but you just have to be very disciplined. You have to be, and you have to get everybody singing from the same hymn book here, and that's just not happening right now.
I don't think so. I think if you just have Trump start doing wild tweets, but telling the truth, exposing these things, it'll create a buzz, and then it gives all this ammunition to alternative media to start talking about it. Then Joe Rogan will bring it up, like, "Well, we hear about the Bucha massacre or this, do you hear what happened in Kursk?"
Right.
So,
we are getting some of that already. The problem is Trump himself is not consistent. I mean,
but I'm just saying Trump could do it. He just needs to.
Well, yeah, I think you need more. I mean, the pushback is going to be enormous. You couldn't make progress if he just was he's already done. Achieved some successes, and I think it's made a kind of a dent in the narrative by many of his comments. And he could do a lot more himself. But to really challenge that narrative and to supersede it, I think you do have to have a disciplined team. But they could do it. I mean, that's one thing that like Americans are good at. They could do it, but they have to, you have to have somebody at the top who really understands and has the discipline and foresight to carry it out. And we just don't have that in Donald Trump, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah, it's just frustrating because I think it could happen. I think it could be easier than you're making it out to be. I think because I mean, Trump, one of the appeals of him was that the pushback he could deal with. He doesn't care about the pushback. Like, he tweets crazy stuff all the time. I mean, he tweeted a war crime that he committed in Yemen, bombing these Houthis standing around, and he didn't get nearly enough pushback for that. But I can just...
unfortunately, it was celebrated, I think, probably by a certain number of people. That's a
but I'm just saying, like, it could happen, and I feel like that's the way that we can end this this war, we can reach some negotiated settlement, pull out support, because the way it's going now, it's so sad to see that, there's just there's very few Ukrainian men left, it seems like. I mean, I don't know what the numbers are, but it's just you're scraping the bottom of the barrel. Like you said, we've never seen something like this. Even the Nazis were doing this type of level of forced mobilization. So it's just
Right.
the horrors that you're inflicting upon the Ukrainian people. If you really like Ukraine, if you support Ukraine, you need to end this war for the sake of the Ukrainians living there. It's just, but the way it's going, and the Europeans, I don't know what the hell they're thinking. I just don't understand why they're just so like, okay, well, are they going to take up the mantle of just if the U.S. pulls out? They just don't want to negotiate at all. Like you said, it's this ideological moral high ground that they just have to stand
Yeah.
by, and they
Right.
won't. They just repeat these nonsense phrases over and over again. It's just they're all going to. Everyone's going to die. It seems like in Ukraine, all the men are going to die in Ukraine if we keep doing this. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and
I don't
then
know. Unfortunately, it's really sad. It's really horrifying.
well, okay. Well, do we want to move over to another horrifying part of the world?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I mean, we're just talking about all these men dying in Ukraine, and who knows how many more and how many will be left. But what about in Gaza? Like, are we going to see? Are we just going to watch them all die in Gaza? We've been watching a lot of people die in Gaza, and this is even more painful because so many are civilians. The vast
Yeah.
majority are civilians. But now, I mean, are we going to start seeing mass starvation, and we're just going to watch this on our phones, see emaciated people starving to death, children with their ribs being, exposed because they don't. Like, how far does it have to go? Will we just watch the whole thing? Is everybody going to die?
I don't know. I mean, it's already gone farther than I thought was possible. So in a different time, I thought, well, this couldn't be possible. It couldn't happen. But it's on the verge of happening. Mass starvation deaths. There already are starvation deaths. A significant number in Gaza, and I think there's no question there are a lot of deaths that are linked to malnutrition. Malnourished children are more susceptible to all kinds of diseases and so forth. So maybe the cause of death wasn't starvation, but it was clearly a contributing factor. We don't know how many really are dying overall. Again, it's hard to know because the health system has been just almost entirely obliterated. And the way that, they keep track of these deaths is by people who come to the hospital. A lot of people now, there isn't any hospital for them to go to. And then, the hospital doesn't even, often doesn't have the staff. And so a lot of deaths aren't being recorded. It's been 52 days, I think, maybe 53 now, since the Israelis completely shut down all shipments of food, humanitarian aid, fuel, into, and other necessities into Gaza entirely. It's like they had cut it way back. They even did that before October 7th. They were always kind of restricting those shipments. And but now that they cut this off entirely. And then we've also talked about how, electric power was cut off entirely. So that means that, for example, desalination plants can't work. They don't have fresh water. Sewage treatment plants don't work. The places are flooded with sewage, and all of this contributes to disease. There's just at some point the Gazans had managed to store up a certain amount of food, because they always knew there's a risk of a couple of weeks, but apparently the stores have entirely run out. So we are looking at mass starvation if something doesn't change radically soon.
That's crazy. It's so crazy that this is happening. It's not like this is. It's not like a natural disaster and we have all these people die. This is something that we are, allowing to happen. A mass starvation of a civilian population. Like, why can Egypt send in food? Like, how there's nothing that anybody can do?
Yeah.
Surely
Well,
there's things we can do,
right.
right?
Well, now the Israelis have just complete control of all, the border crossings, including the Rafah crossing, which is where Egypt used to have control, but that has been taken over by the Israelis. The Philadelphia corridor.
At what point does it just become undeniable to everybody that this is a genocide? Like
Well, it
when we
should be
see
right now, but that's
right, but I mean, like if we see this mass starvation, all
Yeah,
these
right.
bodies, surely at that point, right? Anybody that has any doubt in their mind, like, oh, it seems like they're going a little overboard, but I know it's war, it's complicated. It's like this is not war anymore.
Yeah.
This is the extermination of a people.
Right. Yeah. And that's really what the statistics say. I mean, and more than all the countless videos that we said tell us that this is not war. This is an attack on a civilian population. I mean, the character of these two wars is very, very different. Actually, like civilian casualties in the Russian war are just very low by historical standards. They happen, and they're all tragedies, but they're very, very low by historical standards. But I don't know if you've ever had a war where civilian casualties were so high as a proportion of all casualties as in this Gaza war. The Israelis are just setting records just in the number of women and children killed and medical personnel killed.
Journalists.
Yeah, journalists, exactly. All these. I mean, these are historic. They're surpassing World War II numbers. And they're doing this. But yeah, again, it's just like you occasionally get a little criticism, a bit of hand-wringing from Western leaders, but the weapons continue to flow.
It's so awful.
Yeah.
As these civilian casualties mount and more and more people are becoming aware of it and they're seeing all this devastation, and especially just the children, it's so heart-wrenching to see these children that are blown apart. And but we'll see, less and less support for Israel. Like we already saw that Gallup poll that came out maybe a month ago that said a majority of Americans, I think it was 53%, have a negative view of Israel now. And that number will continue to go up. And if we do begin to see mass starvation, like at what point when like 70% of Americans, 75, 80% of Americans, like how high do we have to go? How many people have to die to get that number high enough to where there's actual change that happens in this country?
Right. That's the only silver lining of the horror of this war is changing perceptions of Israel. And where they really matter, where these perceptions really matter, is in the United States. And so, it's just, again, it's really, I don't want to say that this is a reason for hope because it's such a horror, but there is, a silver lining if the Israelis really go down this road. There is resistance within Israel, and there is an awareness among the saner Israelis and IDF leaders that, hey, this could look really, really bad. It's not like they really care, but they say this could look really, really bad, and we could be subject to war crimes, trials and that kind of thing. I mean, I know some IDF generals have made this argument. But at the present time, it's Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and these type of people that have the reins of power, and they seem to be, I know Ben-Gvir is just to hell with all that. We got to starve them out. And if they win, we're talking about mass death. Well, just further mass deaths within Gaza, but it may finally, at some point. I hope sooner rather than later. I just, finally break the back of support for Zionism within this country.
I'm hoping that in the next election, we will have a candidate that is willing to stand up to Israel. That it was so disgusting seeing Biden and Trump both trying to out-Zionist each other. Oh, I'm more of a Israel lover than you are. Biden, you're like a Palestinian, this type of... It's just, I think the awareness now within just the general consciousness of the United States is that, Israel has way too much control over our country. And that's promising. So I think that if you had a candidate in the future that is anti-Israel or just a true America first. No, I mean, it doesn't even have to be anti. Just saying that, Israel is not we're not being controlled by Israel. AIPAC doesn't have power here. We want to have him register as a foreign agent. Like, I think that this could be one of the most important issues in a coming election. Like before, nobody's debating, their position on Israel. That was just sort of a given where America stands for Israel. Most people in America don't really care that much, so it's just like, okay, yeah, whatever. We don't really know what's going on over there. But now it's gotten to the point where people need to adopt a position, and that might be the deciding focal point for any future political primaries or midterms, whatever it is, that people need to adopt a position. And you'll find that candidates that are willing to say that we don't support what Israel's doing here in Gaza and that needs to stop, they will do well,
Yeah.
and then do you think
Yeah,
so?
at some point,
sure.
we're not there yet.
How are we not there yet?
Well, yeah, I know. It's amazing that we aren't, but we aren't. I mean, it's just recently, I can't remember the guy's name. He was a Democrat from Brooklyn, I believe, who did.
Oh, right.
Yeah, but
Cory Booker or something?
But
was it Cory Booker?
Not Cory,
no.
not Cory Booker, but
So-
but he was a,
I
he was
know
a
what you're
black
talking
man.
about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was
So-
highly critical of Israel and supportive of the Palestinians, but AIPAC got rid of him. And there was another case too. I can't remember it right at this point. And then you say, well, there obviously is this growing anger, especially on the left, in this country against Israel and Zionism in particular. Shouldn't there be candidates reflecting that? And we really don't have that yet. I mean, even you look at AOC, who's supposed to be a far left candidate, or Bernie Sanders. Yeah, they've made some criticisms and even voted for some restrictions. But when you look at it, they're very minor. It's just like essentially it's just a slight deviation. They're not really going after Israel and Zionism in the way they should. We just don't have anybody. I mean, I think the one who's been most principled is Thomas Massey, again, who's not really anti-Israel, but truly America first, saying is, say, hey, we got to end this control of Israel over our country, right? He's been quite open about that, and he's done well. One thing is shown, it's like sometimes, when somebody, this was true of Ron Paul, very conservative Texas district, it's assumed like all these people are just kind of wildly for the military and whatever, and they're going to support every foreign adventure. Ron Paul opposed every last one of them, but he was reelected again and again and again because they knew he was a good man. And I think you see the same thing with Thomas Massey. And if you just have a more courageous individuals and, eventually somebody on the left too, it just says, forget it. They've seen what's happened, but I think, that their power is waning and somebody needs to break through. And when somebody really does, then the dam might break. Yeah. But we're not there yet. Again, it's just...
You're right. You're right. I mean, who's that? Like that Randy Fine guy got, elected.
Yeah.
And he had that tweet saying, "They'll let the streets of Gaza run with blood," stuff
Right.
like this, like just so open.
Yeah.
It's horrifying. All right. I have another question kind of related, just, adopting the Palestinian cause. We're seeing it, resonate more and more with people, but it's hard to get Western countries to openly, denounce what Israel's doing. It seems like the Zionists have a grip not only here in the U.S. but a lot of Western Europe. But the one exception, though, seems to be Ireland, and I see a lot of comments even on our videos saying, free Palestine, and people from Ireland saying, love from Ireland. And it's interesting. How are the Irish sort of at the forefront of the Palestinian cause amongst the Western world, the Anglosphere?
Yeah. Well, I guess maybe it's for historical reasons. They have no love for the Anglosphere because, of course, they were a colony of the British for a long time, and they fought a bloody war for their own independence. And so there has been I think a very strong anti-imperialist streak among the Irish, and I think that's what we're seeing. That's my explanation. There's probably more to it than that, but I think that explains a lot of it.
Yeah, I think adopting that position, like what Ireland has done, it does wonders for a country's soft power, because people want somebody to stand up. So people love Ireland now. It's like they're leading kind of the resistance within the West, And if you're a country that supports Israel, it destroys your soft power quickly. And, none is more apparent than the United States itself, just how much our soft power has gone down because of our unwavering support of Israel and its genocide in Gaza. People don't look at us in a favorable light. That moral superiority that we used to wave around, that moral high ground that we have, it's gone. It's completely gone out from under our feet. And we see, Yemen. People love the Yemenis amongst most of the world. The Houthis. People love, Ireland. Why do they like these countries? People like Iran even now, or Russia and China more because some of them are directly opposing Israel and standing up, like Ireland and Yemen, the Houthis, and the other ones, Russia and China are not directly opposing it, but they're offering an alternative, and they're showing,
Right. They do vote against it, and they do, they haven't taken real strong measures. But, for example, actually the Houthis themselves, I think early on said that Russian and Chinese ships can go through the Red Sea. It's just like they
right. They
understood.
singled them out. They
Right.
understood that we're
Right.
part of this, that we're
Right.
supporting, the support for Iran, from Russia and China, and we know Iran is supporting the Houthis. So they are connected to the axis of resistance. So that's another thing that is, accelerating the decline of the U.S. empire and bringing the rise of the multipolar world is our country's position on Israel. Like, I think this has destroyed our soft power more than anything else, I think. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's no. Initially, the war in Ukraine probably helped the U.S. and it was damaging to Russia. But as time went on, things really started to change. And we've seen a lot of incidents, for example, in places such as various parts of Africa, where protesters will wave the Russian flag, and they do it because they see Russia actively resisting. It's not just, but then, I think even more important is what's happening in Palestine. It's the same thing. It's just like those countries like Yemen that are actively resisting. There's a great part of the world that say, look to them. At least, these people give us hope. These people, give us cause to believe in our future.
Right. It gives me hope. I've never been to Ireland, but now I want to go. I'm like, I can wear my keffiyeh out there. It's just great to see, them standing up. So, thank you, Ireland, and the Houthis. Well, what's going on with the Iran negotiations? You said there was going to be a follow-up thing in Oman. Do you know where we're at right there?
Yeah, actually, I don't know. I didn't hear anything about the most recent meeting. There was some reports that there was going to be a meeting on Wednesday. But I haven't heard anything. I'm still hopeful about it, and for that reason, I haven't canceled my trip to Iran. We're still going. I spoke to the tour guide and said, look, it's kind of scary, and if things, if the rhetoric starts to become more warlike again, we might have to cancel. But for as of the present, we're still going ahead with this. I guess in the case of Iran, well, one thing I was wondering, I pointed out that like with the Gaza ceasefire, it started off very positively, and then the Americans and the Israelis just tore it up. And so, are we going to say the same thing with Iran? Possibly. But I think there's a reason to be hopeful, and it's for the reason that I gave earlier, is that Iran has deterrence. Right, they can fight back, and I think that's why the Americans are in these negotiations right now. I think that's why Trump decided to tone down his rhetoric. I think there's no question about it. It's just like in the case of Gaza, they just don't have deterrence. That's the sad truth. I mean, there's very, very little. Maybe the only deterrence they have now is what the Houthis and their blockade on commercial shipping, Israeli-linked commercial shipping in the Red Sea. But it's something that Israel can survive with American support. But Iran's different. Iran can fight back. And so, like in the first case, with the case of Gaza, really the Gazans are depending on the honor of the Israelis and the Americans. And I'm sorry to
Mm.
say, and I say this with some shame, but that's a mistake. There's just no honor among them. But in the case of Iran, the Iranians know they can't depend on honor, and they have the power, to create this deterrence, and they created it. And so I think there is reason to believe, to be hopeful there, that these negotiations will go through. And first of all, the fact is that we did have a JCPOA before. We could do it again. There's something just slightly different. Again, some face-saving addition to it. So it can be done. It's already been proven. And Obama, he was subjected to a lot of pressure. There was a lot of, there's always been this faction within the government that's opposed to any kind of deal with Iran and wants to attack Iran. And they're still there. Maybe they're even stronger now. But Obama was able to face them down and do it. Trump could too, if he really sticks with it. And let's just hope he does. So yeah, I'm just kind of broadly speaking, I am hopeful, but we still have a minefield ahead of us.
Yeah, the scary thing is Netanyahu. It's just he has to have this war. He can't
Yeah,
stop. This is his one chance. He's got to finish this. If things stop in Gaza and we just stop now, it's like, okay, you committed half a genocide. It's not okay. It's not going to fly. He's going to be thrown out of office. He's going to be put in jail. He in his mind, I think this is his one shot to create greater Israel, and he's got to take out Iran to do it. And so he's going to do whatever he can. I don't think he's going to take no for an answer. I'm thinking false flags, try to attack on his own, whatever it is, turn all the screws on our politicians and the media outlets in the West to get this to happen. So we'll see. It's such a crazy thing that every time these Oman negotiations happen when it's going out, I'm thinking like, okay, well, are we going to war with Iran? Oh, I guess I'll maybe find out on Saturday if we're going to have a potentially world-ending war. And this isn't even, and for many people, they're not even really paying attention to this. They're not even thinking about the Oman negotiations and how important it is. But it's like, guys, realize that if this goes south, the U.S. could be embroiled into a huge war with Iran, and Iran is backed by Russia and China. This could go south real quickly. One thing we know about war is like once it starts, it's hard putting that cat back in the back
yeah,
in the bag, and it can go any which way, and it spreads. It can go quickly, and then all of a sudden, boom! Oh, millions dead, tens of millions dead. World economies destroyed. The whole world set back 100 years. Who knows? And people are like, I wonder what P. Diddy is up to. Oh, let's see what the Kardashians are doing. Like nobody, I just wish people would pay more attention. Just think of how important this is right now in our life. That these Oman negotiations, and I like you said, there was supposed to be one that happened on Wednesday. It didn't happen. I was just thinking, like, wait, are
yeah.
we
I'm
going to
not
find out?
sure. I just haven't heard anything. So I guess my assumption is nothing happened because I didn't hear anything about it.
Right. So it's like, well, we'll see. I'm just thinking, we'll see what happens. Are we going to war or not? I hate that that's the situation we're in.
Yeah, yeah. Um, right. Well, I think with the American public, it's just that they're used to these TV wars, where we attack countries, weak countries that really can't defend themselves, and it's just see all this very exciting TV footage. I remember the first Iraq War. That was a big deal, and everybody loved it, and um, the second one, well, initially it was supported. It was just like we were in Baghdad in short order after bombing the hell out of them for a month, and then it was quite popular. It was just that when we got bogged down that it started to become unpopular. But still the great majority of people never felt the consequences. They didn't actually have to pay for it. It was a huge cost, but the U.S., because it has a world's reserve currency, was able to print more money and cover up the cost. Um, if you didn't belong to a military family, you didn't know anybody that died. So in general, wars are sometimes are far off things, and sometimes they're even fun. That's the way Americans think it. And there's been a real attempt to downplay the strength of Iran and say, oh, they're completely a basket case, or they're just defenseless, right? We've been hearing all this, and I think that's probably that propaganda has its source with Israel, or at least with its supporters. Again, if they really were that defenseless, why isn't Israel itself flying over there? They know they can't do it. They know they're not defenseless, and they're trying to get the U.S. to do it. But I think we can still have enough realists in places like the Pentagon are telling Trump, "Hey, this I don't care what you heard on TV. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be really, really ugly. I suggest you negotiate."
I really hope so. I really hope so. I think there's just one of the reasons maybe a lot of people aren't paying such close attention to what's happening with Iran is that there's just so much chaos going on in the world. We
Yeah,
focus on the Ukraine war conflict and what's happening in Israel, Palestine, touch on China, but you got the tariff war going on. You got the fact that the dollar might crash, the stock markets, everybody's
yeah,
watching this. There's just so much chaos. And I think a problem is chaos breeds more chaos. If you're not able to tamp it down, then it allows for some of these other things to spiral out of control without people paying attention because they're too fixated on the border crisis or whatever it is, or the beef with China and getting mad at Canada or whatever it is.
yeah.
And so I think that's one of the dangers where we've entered into a chaotic period. And
Yeah, I think that's a very good
that's,
point. I think that's a very good point. I just, like I think I said earlier, even a few years ago, let's just pretend nothing's happened in Gaza, nothing's happening in Iran, the Ukraine war never occurred. We would all be talking about what's happening in the West Bank, because there has been a huge spike in violence and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, much more than ever since 1967. That would be a huge story, and we would be talking about it, and people would be concerned and saying, "How can we don't even talk about it? Nobody even mentions it because it's just been superseded. It's been drowned out by all this other chaos, like as you're pointing out."
right. Yeah, Pandora's box has been opened. And I feel like, unfortunately, we might be at the point where it's just going to chaos is going to just wreak havoc. And then we're going to see what's left, when it's all over. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm not being too pessimistic, but it's kind of how I'm feeling a little bit. Are you feeling that way?
Yeah, right. I mean, it's just like whenever you think it can't get any crazier, it does. It was just, again, we haven't even talked about the tariff war recently, but it's huge and it's ongoing and it's going to have huge consequences. I think, again, those are consequences that Americans are going to feel. A lot of them don't really understand how big these other shifts are because they're going to feel the impact in the short term and, where it really counts to them in their pocketbooks.
Right. Okay, Dad. Well, I think we can end it there.
Okay.
Okay. Have a good rest of your day.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.